this National Press Foundation webinar on cybersecurity for journalists. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld, the Director of Programs here at NPF, by Shane Harris, Senior Writer at Foreign Policy Magazine, winner of National Defense, and author of, this is my Jon Stewart moment, The Watchers, The Rise of America's Surveillance State, a book that proves how far ahead of the curve he actually is because it was published in 2010. And also coming to us from Santa Monica, California, we have Eva Galperin. She's a former systems administrator with degrees in political science and international relations, who has also done research at the U.S.-China Policy Institute and now is a global policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
If you're tweeting today, we are at Nat Press. Shane, do you have a Twitter handle?
Yep, the Twitter address is Shane W. Harris.
And Eva, do you have a
And
Twitter handle?
my Twitter handle is Evacide, EVACIDE.
All right, let's get started. Shane, I'm going to ask you, why is online security important to journalists?
Right. So I'll come at that perspective as somebody who writes, in the United States right now and is writing on national security, and a lot of classified issues come up in the context of reporting. It's important from my perspective for two main reasons. One, we do have an obligation to our sources to at all times protect their identities, their confidentialities, particularly when they've asked to speak to us in a capacity that their quotes are not going to be attributed to them. And right now, it's become extremely difficult in the current environment to do that. And what I'm getting at is the Obama administration, it's a matter of public record, has prosecuted more individuals in government and more contractors as well for speaking to the press than any previous administration has. So we find ourselves now having to go to great lengths to ensure that that there aren't records of our conversations beyond even the written notes that we're taking down. We're finding that the Justice Department has, for instance, subpoenaed the phone records of the Associated Press to look for connections between reporters at the AP and their sources. It's not just that the government is interested in trying to find the contents of what we're talking about with our sources, but they're also looking for transactional records as well to try and link reporters to the sources and build a case that they are in fact talking to them. So it's become incredibly important for us to find ways to keep not just the contents of our conversations safe and secure, but even to try and not leave a record, frankly, to the extent that we possibly can.
So let me ask you, when people talk about metadata, this is what they're talking about, right? The content is what you actually said.
Right.
The metadata is the evidence that you were communicating with someone.
That's right. So the content of a conversation obviously could be incriminating, right? A recording of a phone call and an email that you might send to someone. The content of that could be incriminating and useful if the government were investigating your sources. But just the fact that you made contact with them and there's a record of that is something that I know sources who I'm in touch with lately have been very loath to respond in any way to people trying to reach out to them electronically, and you have to now do that in person. So there's our primary obligation to our sources, and secondarily there is we have not seen journalists prosecuted in the United States, but that risk has been out there for a number of years now and feels especially pronounced of late. There are certainly journalists who have been subpoenaed to try and reveal their sources. They're now tied up in legal proceedings. Jim Risen at the New York Times is probably the best example of that. His case may very well end up in the Supreme Court. The government's trying to get him to testify as to the identity of a source. But we find ourselves, I think, having to take even more precautions than we did in the past to ensure that, again, our online communications are secure, but also that we're we're doing as much of that, I think, verbally now as we possibly can, and in person, and not relying on even the phone, I think, the way that we used to, and certainly not relying on email to have any conversation of any sensitive nature at all.
Well, this really makes the journalist's job much harder. Eva, what is your perspective on this?
Well, I come from a largely global perspective. I spend most of my time training journalists outside of the United States, and if you think things are bad in the US, I can tell you that they are noticeably worse outside of the U.S. Journalism is dangerous work, and if you are really speaking truth to power, chances are that you have made somebody in power angry. And in countries where the rule of law is weak, journalism is especially dangerous. Journalists are detained, arrested, beat up, tortured, killed. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 120 journalists were killed in 2012, 28 in Syria, 12 in Somalia, 7 in Pakistan, 4 in Brazil, 2 in India. And about a third of those were caught in crossfire or combat. But what's particularly interesting is that 46%, nearly half of them, were just outright murdered. So the risks are very high. And that is particularly worrying. And furthermore, even if you are feeling particularly brave, if you are a journalist who goes out into the field and into combat all the time with their flak jacket, like you are a badass. Your sources are not necessarily badasses. And when you compromise your privacy, you have compromised not only your privacy, but the privacy of everybody that you contact. Privacy is really one of those things that plays out to the lowest common denominator, and you are putting all of those people into danger. And while you can make an intelligent, informed decision about whether or not you want to put yourself in danger, the people who you contact are not making an informed decision, and so you're really taking a risk on their behalf, which I think is profoundly unethical. A pretty good example of this is in the fall of 2011, British journalist and filmmaker Sean McAllister traveled to Syria for the purpose of shooting a documentary about the ongoing conflict between the opposition and the Assad regime, which was really just sort of getting started at the time. McAllister met with a 25-year-old dissident and computer expert in Damascus who goes by the pseudonym of Kardach. Reports that Kardach had agreed to be interviewed on camera with the the Columbia Journalism Review reported that Kardach had agreed to be interviewed on camera with the understanding that McAllister would blur his face before publishing the footage. But in October of 2011, Syrian security agents seized the camera and detained McAllister. They seized his laptop, his cell phone, and all of the footage for the documentary, including images and contact information that could be used to identify the activists he interviewed. When Kardach heard that McAllister had been arrested, he immediately packed his bags and fled to Lebanon. And he reports that several of the activists he had put in touch with McAllister had been arrested, and at least one had disappeared. One other slightly more lighthearted example of this is the example of Robert King, who works for Vice magazine. I don't know how many of you have heard of John McAfee, who's the founder of McAfee Antivirus, but McAfee was wanted for questioning in Belize in a case related to the murder of his neighbor, Gregory Fall. And a couple months ago, he went into hiding, but not before starting a blog and taking numerous press interviews proclaiming his innocence. So he claimed to have fled the country in the company of 2 journalists from Vice magazine and his girlfriend Sam. To bolster his claim, Vice published a story titled, and I am not kidding, "We are with John McAfee right now, suckers," complete with a photo of McAfee and the Vice editor-in-chief, Rocco Castora, taken by Vice photographer Robert King on his iPhone 4S. Now you may wonder right now, Eva, how do you know exactly what sort of phone this guy has? And that's because he failed to wipe any of the EXIF data from the photo. And among the sort of metadata that you could get with this photo, which had been posted, were the GPS coordinates of the location where the photo had been taken. Location information embedded in the photo indicates that the foursome is in Guatemala, specifically at the Rio Dulce, near the Ranchon Mary restaurant, by a swimming pool, which you can see via Google Earth. Authorities came, they arrested McAfee. McAfee had to flee back to the United States, and I don't think the United States and Belize have any kind of, even if they have an extradition treaty, that he hasn't actually been charged with anything. But this is a situation in which Vice magazine, literally through failing to properly scrub this data, put one of their sources into physical danger.
Well, you've actually gone a long way toward answering one question that we already have, which is, can you give some context as to which types of stories or sources we need to worry about? Obviously, if you're reporting from Syria or from any other war zone, those are sources you have to worry about. Do either of you have any other thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I mean, if you're reporting on anything touching on classified information, certainly in the United States, that has become the big area of concern right now. We haven't seen as much pressure brought to bear on confidential sources of anything other than classified information. We haven't seen people who are talking about the healthcare website breaking down or anything like that. Although who knows, that may be in the future. But that's been especially sensitive area. Anything dealing with intelligence, national security, military. I think those are sort of the places where you have like a caution flag that you need to put out.
There are some other circumstances under which you really want to think about your privacy and the security of your communications, and that's not just when you are covering the national security beat or when you have a source that needs to maintain their anonymity, but you have to keep in mind that if you talk to other members of the news organization, that undermining your security could help an attacker to undermine their security. So if you even talk to people who cover national security or who have to be very careful about their sources, by being lax with your security, you're potentially endangering their security. So that it's really something that everybody needs to worry about, no matter what their beat is.
Very good point to make. So we've gotten this context now about the importance of protecting security. Eva, I think you have some slides that will go into detail about various types of encryption and maybe some tools. I'd like to see if we can share your screen now and show those and have you run through them.
Excellent. All right, so let's begin with the probably your greatest weakness is your password. Your password is terrible. The first thing that you should do is lock everything. You should have a password on your phone. You should have a password on your computer. The password on your phone should kick in after about a minute or two, no matter how inconvenient this is. The same thing with locking your screen. If you walk away from your screen for more than a minute or two, it should ask for your password. The other thing that you should keep in mind is that you should use a password safe. Some examples are LastPass and OnePass and KeyPass. And what these programs do is these are programs that you can install on either your phone or your computer, any of your devices, and they will generate long and difficult passwords for you. You can basically ask it to generate a strange character, 20-character long password. It will be an individual different password for every one of your accounts, and then you simply cut and paste it from this program into each one of your logins. This is especially important because if somebody compromises one of your accounts, they will not be able to compromise any of your other accounts by using that password. The other thing that you should be aware of is on services that make it available, you should use two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is available on Twitter, Facebook. I think Google makes it available, and what two-factor authentication does is once you turn it on, it is not enough to have your password in order to log into your account. You must also have an authentication code, which can be sent to your phone, or if you travel a lot, as I know journalists often do, then what you should do is you should print out some of these codes and keep them on your person in case of an emergency. Since I understand that having messages sent to the same phone number is really not always feasible. Last of all, please beware of password recovery questions. If you are a reasonably famous person, as journalists sometimes are, if you have a Wikipedia page, if you have people interviewing you on a regular basis, then it's pretty easy to find the answers to many of the most typical password recovery questions, like where did you go to school, or what street did you grow up on, or what was the name of, what's the name of your pet. As a general rule, I recommend answering your password recovery questions incorrectly. That is generally what I do. My mother's maiden name is Rumpelstiltskin. What we have here is just a quick note saying that Sarah Palin fell victim to this problem with her password recovery questions not too long ago. You should also make sure that when you are using services online, when you're browsing, you are browsing using HTTPS. If you look at the top of your browser, where the URL is, you should see that it begins with the letters HTTP, and if we are lucky, there's an S in there. And the S stands for secure. What this does is it makes sure that your data is being sent encrypted over the network. If you do not send your data encrypted over the network, then anybody else who is sitting on your network, including the guy sitting in your coffee shop, or the people at the ISP, or whoever it is that you're working with, can very easily sniff all of your traffic, and that includes everything that you enter into your browser, everywhere that you're going, all of your emails, all of your passwords. It's very disturbing. So don't do that. In order to make sure that you're using HTTPS on a site which supports it, I strongly recommend using HTTPS Everywhere. HTTPS Everywhere is a browser extension for either Firefox or Chrome. Incidentally, if you're using browsers which are neither Firefox nor Chrome, please stop. So you should use Firefox or Chrome. You should use this browser extension, and it will make sure that if a site makes HTTPS available, that you are using it. This is HTTPS Everywhere. This is what it looks like. You can get it at the EFF website. Anonymity. So for those situations in which you need to either circumvent censorship on the network that you are on, or situations in which you need to decouple your IP address, which gives away your geographic location, from your browsing or whatever it is that you are doing online, I very strongly recommend Tor as a tool, and you can get there at www.torproject.org. They have a product called the Tor Browser Bundle, which works on Windows, Mac, Linux, and Android, and it makes sure that when you are browsing, essentially it looks like you are coming from somewhere else. And this is especially important if you need to maintain your anonymity. Your role as a journalist in maintaining your responsibility for sources is also to train them to keep themselves secure and anonymous. Here you can see a photo of General Petraeus and the woman who turned out to be his biographer, Paula Broadwell, and it turns out girlfriend. They had a situation in which they were exchanging messages in a way that was not particularly anonymous. Don't do that. Let's talk a little bit about PGP. So PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy, because engineers are pithy. And what it does is it uses cryptography to encrypt your email end-to-end, meaning that you send it to someone and they decrypt it. And that means that anybody who is listening on the network or who is listening anywhere along the way, for example, if you're using Google or Yahoo or Microsoft email, your email is encrypted using SSL, meaning that it is encrypted at the transport layer, but it is not encrypted end-to-end. So anybody who's listening in on the network cannot read your email, but for implementing PGP is a combination of Enigmail and Thunderbird. That's usually how I do it. PGP is an enormous pain to use. In fact, most end-to-end encryption is notoriously difficult to use, but it is worth learning because it is a really important tool in your arsenal for anonymous communications. I also very strongly recommend for internet messaging that people learn to use OTR. OTR stands for off the record. The tools that I usually use are either Adium or for Mac, or Pigeon, which is available for Windows. And you can enable OTR literally by just clicking on the little lock. That is especially important. Please do not confuse off-the-record messaging, OTR, in Adium or Pigeon with off-the-record messaging in GChat or AOL Instant Messenger. They also have an option called off-the-record, but it does not, in fact, encrypt your communications. What it does is it just keeps both Google and AOL from logging a history of your chat. So please don't confuse those two, because it's potentially very, very dangerous.
Eva, can I
And yes.
Snapchat?
Snapchat? What about it?
familiar with-
Yes, I'm familiar with Snapchat.
So just the question, because it is immediately erased, that doesn't mean that it's off the record.
Actually, as it turns out, Snapchat was handing over unopened Snapchats to law enforcement upon request. So
Okay.
once the thing is opened, you're probably safe, but it's not. It's really not guaranteed. I would not use Snapchat in order to try to have secure communications.
Okay, good. And we did have a question earlier about Google and Hotmail. Should I use Google or Hotmail? And it sounds like the answer is, if you're interested in end-to-end encryption, no.
No, if you are interested in end-to-end encryption, if you want to make sure that when the government comes to Hotmail or Google with a warrant or a subpoena or a national security letter, that they cannot hand over your data, then you want to use end-to-end encryption combined with your Gmail or Hotmail account. So that all that they have is a big block of ciphertext.
Okay, good. Let's
All right.
move on.
I do think there's one last topic to cover very, very, very quickly, and that is phishing and malware. The most common ways that people have their accounts compromised is through getting either an email or a Skype or Facebook or some other type of message saying, hey, click on this link or download this particular thing, and they gather up your login credentials, or they covertly install malware on your computer, which allows them to have full control of it, log all of your keystrokes, take screenshots, and that sort of thing. So this is by far the greatest sort of security vulnerability that most people have. For example, in the report on the advanced persistent threat, the Chinese hacking of the New York Times, that is how the Chinese got into the New York Times. So please be especially careful about emails that look like they're coming from people that you know, or that might have juicy details in them, or want you to open strange attachments that are not actually from those people, and where the attachments are not what they seem.
Okay, well, this has been really informative. Those are great slides. Shane, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we go to questions?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that how we sort of practically implement this in our office is we follow a lot of these best practices, and we do use some of these tools. Some of them are obviously more convenient than others. I mean, some using PGP or GPG for email. I mean, obviously you have to have somebody on the other end of it who's communicating with you in that way. We are looking also at a product called Silent Circle, which allows for encrypted phone communications between two people who are using the product, as well as encrypted text and image transfers. They had an encrypted email program as well, which they, on their own initiative, decided to shut down because they did not believe that they could keep it entirely secure. from NSA surveillance and from other government surveillance. I actually was moderating a panel with the CEO of Silent Circle this morning, and they said they are bringing back an email component to their package. But they sell this to you as a package, and that can be a real good option for some people if you want to buy it for yourself, or your company can buy it for you. But it's basically sort of like having a second phone bill, almost come to you, and you can do it that way. We've also tried experimenting with certain encrypted chat programs and not had a great deal of success with those. We tried something called CryptoCat once, which we found to be a bit unstable and a bit hard to use in a group setting. But just generally speaking, I think on a practical level, the tools are great, but also it's important to just practice good operational security and a high degree of discretion. Even if you have these encrypted communications, which are great, I still think it's a best practice not to be discussing sensitive issues in an email, but to meet in person whenever possible with your sources. It's not always possible, and obviously we have these tools to assist our reporting and to make it more convenient. But it's good to be, a little bit of paranoia can go a long way into improving operational security, just in general, I think.
Good points. I have a question. If you are using one of these tools to encrypt your email, does it make you a target? Is the NSA sort of looking at who's trying to keep secrets, and is that an issue?
Yeah, I mean, the reporting that we've seen on this so far is that the NSA has the authority to retain encrypted communications for a period of 5 years, and to retain them in bulk. So this is one of the first leaks that actually came out from the documents that Snowden gave to The Guardian and others. So if you're communicating in an encrypted fashion, yes, technically they could capture that information and keep it until they develop the ability to break the encryption, or I suppose they could try and get the keys in other ways. So it can make you a target in a sense. Users of Tor could consider themselves to be targeted. The NSA has famously tried to crack the Tor network and to peel back the anonymity on that. Now, on the plus side, what we understand from the reporting on this is that they did not have a lot of success in doing that. So if you're using Tor, you could be effectively making yourself a target of more suspicion, but Tor may be good enough that it's actually keeping you anonymous from the NSA. So that's a plus in Tor's favor. But on the flip side of that is just to communicate entirely in the open, which presents its own risks. And I think, as Eva correctly laid out, I mean, we have the issues of the NSA and the U.S. government looking to try and subpoena information, make connections between journalists and their sources. But obviously, if you're in a different country with an authoritarian regime, they're looking for content. They're looking at that route of very good encryption and shielding your location as default, I think.
Eva, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was actually the pretty good overview.
I'm looking at additional questions, and I have to say mine are not scrolling too well, but it looks like there's a question about whether there are better options than Skype for calls.
The most important thing to keep in mind with Skype is that if your metadata, if the information about who you're calling, how long you're talking to them, and sort of your text messages back and forth via Skype are particularly sensitive, I strongly discourage the use of Skype. Because tools to monitor this sort of data are regularly sold to governments all over the world. It's trivial to intercept, and in fact they do so, not in order to spy on journalists necessarily and discover who their sources are, but to detect Skype conversations, and they can on international phone calls. So this is widely available software to governments. Furthermore, Skype does have its own transparency report, which was issued when Microsoft put out its very first transparency report, which talks about how many requests they got from the government and how they responded to them. but it's really unclear just how accurate it is, because as more and more revelations come to light as a result of the Snowden leaks, it's become clear that the NSA at least considers breaking Skype to be trivial. What I would recommend as an alternative, there is an open source alternative called Jitsi, Jitsi, which has a lot of the same functionality, but really hasn't undergone like a very serious security review. So it's a sort of a weak recommendation. And if you are not particularly concerned about the possibility that Google will have the contents of your communications, I recommend Google Hangouts. So really, it all depends on your threat model.
Another, just as a tip, I think too, is to the extent that you can, if you find that your source network that you generally deal with, if those individuals are using one particular type of encryption program or communication, for instance, Silent Circle is actually rather widely used among people in the intelligence community and the special operations community for their personal use. So that's one, like, being a reporter who covers that area, it's a notch in favor of adopting that, because you're going to be communicating with somebody who already has one of those phone numbers, so you can be doing your end-to-end. So that's something to think about, is, what's used among the people that you want to be in contact with.
Good to know. Lots of viewers are asking questions about specific tools and software. I wonder if, Eva, you could go back and summarize the specific recommendations that you've made.
Yes, definitely lock everything down. Do not repeat your passwords. Be careful with your password questions. Use a password safe, such as KeePass or LastPass. I use transport layer encryption, which you can make sure that you're using HTTPS everywhere on either your Chrome or Firefox browser. You should also learn to use OTR for chat, and familiarize yourself with PGP encryption, so that when absolutely necessary, you can PGP encrypt email. If you are concerned about anonymity, you should learn to use Tor browser. And as a alternative to Dropbox, generally I recommend SpiderOak.
A question has come in about whether we need to think about security when sources deliver data on a USB drive. Mm. Who wants to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just highly suspicious of inserting any USB drive or sort of external media into to my computer. I guess I would probably advise a source not to do it that way if I had the chance, and if they've already done it, maybe the damage on their end is already done. That kind of thing could have been tracked if there's an electronic transfer. Good old-fashioned handing it off in paper is great. Some of the best stuff that I've ever received actually from confidential sources was in the mail. I mean, some documents that show up at your office one day, and then the source decides how they're going to contact you. But I would be, hesitant, particularly when dealing, just as a reporter in Washington, if I were dealing with sources from any foreign government, and they said, here's something we've given you that you should read, and it's on a USB, I think I would probably politely say, could you please print that out on paper for me, because I'm not putting that in my computer.
Makes sense.
As a quick sort of addition to this, the reason that people are very concerned about USB drives is because they are a vector for malware infection. Particularly if your threat model includes a government, they tend to use this method to infect people's computers all the time. One of the ways in which you can sort of safely use USB drives or deal with particularly sensitive documents that you still want to use a computer to look at or analyze is to engage in air gapping. So you have a computer which is set up, which is never connected to the internet. And you can go ahead and plug a USB drive into it, but afterwards you don't ever plug it into anything else. And it never connects to anything. And the idea is that even if your computer is essentially riddled with viruses, which it has picked up from various USB sticks all over, from all over the world, that because it has no internet connection and has never been connected to the internet, it can't exfiltrate the data to whoever it is that's spying on you.
That's a great suggestion. I mean, that's been a great use of old computers in newsrooms that people are retiring, perhaps, is to then use those as air gap boxes.
Very interesting idea. I think this is analogous to in surgery where they use the so-called dirty nurse, who is the conduit between the sterile operating room and the outside world. And so great suggestion. And we've also heard horror stories about journalists who've been at conferences and just picked up the free USB sticks from various vendors or other people and ended up with bad malware.
Yeah.
So overall, not a good idea. Okay. If you have other questions out there, please continue typing them in. I love this chat happening. There's a lot of conversation going on, and we're eavesdropping on all of it. I had a question about the password encryption programs. This is something that it seems to me is important for every journalist, even if they're not dealing with confidential sources. But I don't understand exactly how it works. Does this mean that every time I sign onto my computer, I have to type a password into my password program?
Not necessarily. Sometimes some of the password programs do have passwords that you can put on them. But the assumption is that if you are already sitting at your computer where you have already entered your password in order to get into your computer and booted up this program, that you can simply copy and paste.
So it's an extra step, but it's not a laborious extra step.
No.
So if I have this program, I'm sitting at my computer, I log in, and now I go to my email account. What happens? The dialog box comes up where I would normally put in my name and my password.
You would launch your password vault. You would search for Google or Gmail, and then you would copy and paste the password from there. The password is usually set up in such a way that even you can't see it much of the time.
So it really is a couple of extra steps, but worth it.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Jennifer asks, what's the most secure way to connect with a sensitive overseas source for the first time if they don't know about encryption?
That's a tough one from my perspective. I mean, most of my sources actually are in the U.S., but if they don't know about it, I think there might be a way to try and Eva, you tell me what you think of this. I mean, just from an operational security standpoint, if you could make an agreement with them to move the conversation immediately over to a secure encrypted channel. The fact that you are doing it may be something that you say in the open, but that may be a risk that you have to take to say to that person, look, we need to move this offline or move this to a safe place and try and limit, do that as quickly as possible. But then, I mean, if you had a way, like a number that you could supply them with, a channel that you could go ahead and set up for them to make it easy to use, I think that would be the most preferable way to go about doing it, to kind of have those tools ready to use for them and kind of be at their service when they need to use it, and then give them as much of a quick crash course as you can.
Eva, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is that your communication with an overseas and sensitive source that doesn't know how to use encryption should be comprised of, here's how to use encryption. Bring them up to speed on a tool, any tool, because using some level of encryption is such an improvement over using no encryption at all. And spying on unencrypted communications is trivial, in the sense that not only can the NSA do it, but just about anybody can do it. I can, if I am sitting on your network, I can pull up a program called Firesheep, and I can use it to hijack many of your social media accounts. I can run I can run sniffers that will sniff all of your traffic and pick up your passwords and all kinds of very, very bad things. And I am not even that technically sophisticated. I am certainly not the NSA. So please, for the love of God, use encryption.
Okay, so next question. Eva, what about those who control the safe software? Can't they also have access to the passwords?
No, your passwords are not stored are not stored by the company. They're stored locally on your computer.
Okay, and
on your
how
phone.
safe are radio phones for security? I don't even know what a radio phone is.
As a general rule, your cell phone is not secure. Just
Okay.
in general,
The signal is pretty easily intercepted.
yes.
The question
Your cell
is
phone is
whether or
a
not
tracking
the
device.
process itself is actually encrypted. And David's point, right, your cell phone is a tracking device.
Right. Well, when someone says radio phone, is that what they're talking about?
I presume they mean like a wireless phone, I mean, so a signal going over the air. They may also mean a satellite phone, which, I mean, those communications can be encrypted, but they can also give away your location.
Which is what
you know,
we think
silent
happens
circle.
when you call them.
That example, what they do is every time a call is made, it initiates a set of keys on each end, and when the call is finished, the keys are deleted.
Mm-hmm.
So each communication is encrypted itself, and for each new time that you do it. So it's going over the airwaves, and you could intercept that signal, but it would be garbled, effectively.
Right. Well, so Janine clarifies that radio phones are actually more like walkie-talkies, which apparently are used for brief calls by a lot of journalists in Mexico.
All right. There are two concerns there. One is that if you are sending a message over the radio, that it is very easy to intercept by anybody with a radio. And the second is that it is very easy to triangulate your location. No, if you are concerned about the content of your communication or your location remaining secret, I would not recommend radio phones.
An interesting question about whether classic phones are more secure than smartphones. I guess you're talking about a regular grounded telephone that's plugged in somewhere.
It's more secure. Well, it can't be intercepted over the air, but it can be intercepted by locking onto a wire. Or we don't really use wires anymore, but I'm using them metaphorically there. I mean, but sure, the communication can be intercepted in transit over any kind of cable that it's going through. So I wouldn't say, that it may be technically more secure, that there are fewer vulnerable points, but maybe only a few, and the communication can still be intercepted.
We have a question about other phone services like Google Voice, Vonage, other voice over IP providers. Any thoughts?
The VoIP providers do have to essentially obey the law in the United States. If they get an order to tap your phone, they will have to do it. But this information is not necessarily collected in en masse, as far as I know.
And one important point maybe to emphasize in this too is that I'll say in the United States, I mean, this goes to what Eva just said, if the government wants to come and serve a legal warrant on a telecommunications carrier, on Google, to get the data, they can get it, right? I mean, so what we're talking about is none of this is foolproof. We're not necessarily even talking about keeping the data completely out of the government's hands. I mean, we know that right now the NSA collects phone records of effectively all phone calls placed in the United States. There's a record of it. Now there are rules on how they can use that data. But you should keep this in mind, is that this is not a perfect lockbox or a steel trap operation here. We're talking about making it more difficult for people to get their hands on the content and to make connections in the metadata. But one way or another, if they go with a legal order to a company to demand that information, the company has to turn it over. What you hope for is that in a case like a silent circle, for instance, if they were to come to them and say, well, give us the encryption keys for your phone call, encrypted phone service, and Silent Circle could say, we don't have them because they're deleted every time the call is made. So if you're looking for like what is the optimal solution, keep those things in mind, that the government, when it comes to the provider, what might they ask for and what might the provider have to turn over and what might they not be able to turn over because it doesn't exist.
Okay, so we know that our metadata is being collected. Is there any way to know if your phone is being tapped?
There's certainly technology that can tell you if a surveillance box is on a network. I don't know if, I mean, Open Technology Institute has done a lot of research in that area. They're part of the New America Foundation. Whether your individual phone has been tapped, I don't know if it can get down to that level.
No.
No. Okay, short answer. The question is being repeated about whether a classic phone is more secure, and I think what we said is any phone can be compromised. It just is done in a different way.
Certainly, but we keep a lot more sensitive data on our smartphones. We keep the login credentials to our Facebook accounts, we keep our email on there, we keep our contact lists on there. A classic phone, or I guess a dumb phone, has limited functionality, which in some ways makes it safer and more secure in the sense that you're not carrying so much stuff around. On the other hand, your locational privacy is still deeply compromised. It is still a tracking device in your pocket. It's just not a tracking device and also all your photos and emails and friends and chats and passwords.
Right. Well, we are going to wrap up the formal part of this right now. If you have additional questions, feel free to keep typing them in, and our experts will hang around for a few minutes and type some answers for you if we have them. I want to thank our guests for being here today, Eva Galperin from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Shane Harris from Foreign Policy, and author of The Watchers. I want to thank all of you for joining us. This has been really exciting today.